And so we're on to the next presentation now, which is going to be a medley presentation. So we've got 5 speakers, and I'm going to hand over to Mariella Marzano to introduce us to the project on biosecurity in Scotland. Mariella.
So good morning, everybody. I'm the project lead for 3 social science-led projects that we're going to talk about today. I just want to start off by saying it was a real joy to apply for and receive social science-led projects, receive funding for. It became a series of interdisciplinary projects with a number of or range of expertise and organisations. And the importance of interdisciplinary research is growing alongside the growth and increase in the volume and diversity of plants and the speed at which we're getting them. And trade represents a very high or important economic value, but it's also high-risk pathways, and the motivations and behaviours, a whole broad spectrum of actors, from traders through to consumers, are likely to be key to any future attempts to improve biosecurity. Making sure I can see the screen. It always changes for you, doesn't it? Anyway, the 3 projects focused on biosecurity risks to Scotland operate at a large scale, but for which there's previously been very little research, and we unimaginatively still call them 04 and 05 and 06. So apologies if we refer to the number rather than the name. The first focuses on the retail sector, primarily online retailers or non-specialist retailers such as supermarkets, DIY or lifestyle stores. The second focuses on building an infrastructure for which almost all have some sort of landscaping element. And the third focuses on environmental planning. So we're talking about restoration, new planting for woodland creation, native woodland creation, or commercial forestry. Within 05 and 06, I'm already referring to the numbers, there was a risk modelling component and that's focused on exploring the value of existing models to inform decisions around biosecurity risks. And the point was to look at whether they could be improved for use in current decision making. Now, we had to be rather nimble-footed due to the pandemic, and this became a separate piece of work rather than integrated into 05 and 06. So that's actually a bonus, really. So these are big issues, but it was a small project to be completed in a short time scale. And I introduced these projects at the PHC conference last March. And as Ian alluded to, that's probably the last time I and maybe many of you were in a room full of people. The timescale was extended to allow us to continue with the research as best as we could through several lockdowns and EU exit, and the reports were submitted at the end of March. We're in the revision stage, very minor revisions, and so they should be available on the website soon. So the research wouldn't have been possible without the efforts and inputs of the amazing team, as Ian also pointed out. And I'm going to hand over the virtual floor to my colleagues, Chris, Berglind, Mike and Rehema, who are going to very briefly present some of the findings from the projects. And most of the rest of the team, I believe, are in the audience, and so they can respond to questions in chat if needs be. But before I hand over to Chris, who's going to guide you through the online non-specialist retailers, I want to say a big thank you to our advisory panel, many of whom went above and beyond. I didn't expect I would need them so much, but they helped us find and contact participants taking part in the research. They provided advice during the lockdowns. They promoted what we were doing so we could pick up speed while everybody was on furlough or various other issues, and they read through our reports. So I want to really, real big thank you. They were with the Dream Advisory Panel. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Chris to start our whistle stop tour, and I'll join you again at the end. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Mariella. So I'm going to talk about the non-specialist and online retailers. So these are the actors that are relatively understudied in sort of plant health at the moment. Usually we concentrate on the specialists, the nurseries and the garden centres. So when I talk about non-specialist retailers, I'm talking about those for which plants and trees are not their primary product type for sale. So this is, as Mariella mentioned, supermarkets and DIY stores. And then online retailers are any type of specialist or non-specialist retailer which sells plants through a website. So that can be they sell exclusively all their plants through a website or just a smaller proportion. And we started off with these 4 research questions. So what types and numbers of plants are being moved in and out of Scotland? What are the current levels of biosecurity knowledge and how do these influence practices? What are the perceived and actual risks of current practices, and who are the relevant individuals, organisations, industry, and what are their biosecurity responsibilities? So trying to find out a bit more about the way that these non-specialist and online retailers work. Next slide, please. Okay, so we started off doing a rapid review of existing knowledge about these parts of the sector. So this was sort of grey literature and industry reports, and there's not loads out there, but we managed to get a little bit. And then we did our data collection on a number of topics across those research questions. So that's assessing the types and flows of plants, awareness of biosecurity practices, looking at those sourcing plants with care, so choosing a supplier, their businesses, risks that they felt to their business and their stock, and their thoughts on consumer demand for biosecurity. And then we touched on accreditation as well. And we did this through a survey of 100 online retailers relevant to Scotland. So they were either based in Scotland or sold plants into Scotland. And we also contacted quite a large number of non-specialist retailers, large retailers, and they're quite a hard to reach category to get to talk to somebody who has the kind of knowledge that we're interested in. But we managed to have 4 in-depth interviews with large retailers working in Scotland across supermarkets and DIY. So I'll highlight some results now. Just picked out a few things to put into this presentation. Check out the report for the rest of the things we talked about. So this is starting talking about plant health knowledge and concern. So we asked people about 6 pests and pathogens which present a risk in Scotland. Asked them a really simple question about self-assessment of knowledge. Do you know nothing, some, or lots? About cholera, citrus longhorn beetle, emerald ash borer, oak processionary moth, Phytophthora ramorum, and xylella. And you can here you can see we've separated the plots by the location of business. So are there differences inside of Scotland to outside of Scotland? So the thing I want to highlight here really is the large green bars for ash dieback and Phytophthora ramorum. So there a lot of people knew lots about it, and those are the ones that are present in Scotland and across the UK more so, whereas there's a lot less knowledge about citrus longhorn beetle, emerald ash borer, and xylella, where they're not yet present in the UK. So next slide, please. So if we move on, looking at that in a bit more detail about the level of concern people have. So these are the same pests and pathogens. Included here now in the second column is the UK relative risk rating, and then the percentage of people who are concerned outside of Scotland and inside of Scotland. So again, you see ash dieback and Phytophthora are the only 2 with greater than 50% concern. So they're the ones that marry up with the previous slide, widely present in the area. And they're also the ones with the highest risk. So that's encouraging. People are concerned about the ones with the highest risk. But what we're looking for here is the mismatch between the risk rating and the level of concern. And you can see the EAB, in particular xylella in the bottom right, a high risk, but a low level of concern. Next slide, please, Mariella. So moving on to sort of sourcing plants with care, we asked online businesses to rank characteristics important in their plant supplier. Okay, so here rank number 1 is the highest and the most important, rank number 9 is the lowest. So if you look at the column on the left-hand side, there the characteristic is most frequently given as most important is quality. That's that light blue bar. So the highest ranking thing was quality. You might think that cost is really important, and you can see that in the sort of dark purple. So it's ranked number 1 by only a very small proportion, but a lot of people said it was between 2 and 5. And then what we're interested in, biosecurity, that's the pink one that's at the base of all those columns. You can see that it gets ranked at number 9 quite a lot. So it's quite low. It's a lot of people are ranking it quite low. The interesting thing here to say is that we, in the interviews we talked to, we know that we've found that sort of pest and disease free is entangled with this concept of quality. So quality for some people could mean pest and disease free, which is biosecurity, or it could mean appears to be pest and disease free. So that's quite a complex mix that we're looking to investigate more. Okay, next slide. So then we asked about assurance schemes for plant health. So from the interviews, we got that large non-specialist multiples had systems that they saw as over and above these independent schemes. So they weren't necessarily ready to engage or use these independent ones with independent auditing because they had their own systems that worked well enough for them as themselves. When we asked the online retailers, people either said, we asked them to whether they're already involved with the plant healthy scheme specifically, whether they would consider it or not. And this table shows a breakdown of location and business type, but you really want to focus on the red box at the bottom, and it shows that over 70% already either participated in some way or would consider it, and that's pretty encouraging. When we asked about barriers to joining these accreditation schemes, people talked about not enough uptake in the sector, so not seeing enough uptake across the sector, and costs, specifically things like paperwork. Okay, so this is my final slide, just a summary on the findings. So knowledge and concern seem related to experience or the geography rather than necessarily the risk. So in terms of further engagement for retailers in this area, maybe focusing more on the level of risk and diseases such as Xylella fastidiosa to increase that level of knowledge so people know what's happening. In terms of pest disease free and high quality, these two things are distinct, but they are entangled. So this is the possibility that we can focus when engaging with retailers on talking about quality than necessarily talking about biosecurity. And that might help us drive better biosecurity behaviours from this sector. And then finally, the encouraging number, over 70% willing to participate or were already in some way involved with the plant healthy scheme, the major barrier being low uptake, and that these non-specialist multiples rely on their own high standards. So increasing the uptake of plant healthy certification scheme or similar schemes would be really good to try and increase the overall level of biosecurity in the sector, and increasing the making it more visible to retailers are more likely to help people to get people to join, and actually having large retailers involved might increase that, could help with that really well. And finally, really better understanding these different links between what are the opportunities and barriers to joining biosecurity schemes and the differences between size and type. That's something that we could investigate more to help promote that. Okay, that's me. I'm going to pass over to Berglind now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I'll be talking about biosecurity risks from large-scale landscaping and infrastructure projects today. So when I say large-scale, I'm talking about things like residential developments, hospitals, business parks, infrastructure such as roads, public open spaces. So those kinds of projects where there's a large landscaping component associated with the project. We wanted to understand where the major infrastructure and landscaping projects are getting their plans from, and are they even aware of this throughout the supply chain? What are the risks and challenges associated with complex supply chains? So really trying to understand what happens from that initial plan to planting and to post-care planting and maintenance and care, and to understand the biosecurity risks that might occur in all of those stages. And linked to that, we wanted to understand who the key players are, when they are involved with these projects, and what they know about biosecurity risks, and are they even aware of this issue? Is it something that they're thinking about? And then we wanted to take all of this learning to better understand how we can promote biosecurity in the future. Next slide. So we started off with a rapid review and synthesis of existing data sets and some grey literature reports and so on. And the key findings from this was that, especially in the construction industry, there's a lack of information and guidance on biosecurity in general. Mariella, could you press the button, please? So what we did was that our partner Harry Watkins at St. Andrew's Botanic Gardens and his team, they identified 81 desk-based projects from the planning portal, and they collected data on the species that had been specified in these projects. They also conducted fieldwork in 34 fieldwork sites, 20 of which were in Scotland. And this was to understand what had been planted compared to what had been specified. Meanwhile, we conducted 11 tracing exercises of people who were involved in these selected projects, and 4 of the projects overlapped so that we had done both the tracing exercise and the field work, and we got a more holistic view of those projects. So, as I said, we did 11 projects in total, and we conducted 18 structured interviews on knowledge, risks, and actions with a number of key players in those projects, and we chose a number of projects as well as case studies to really illustrate what was going on and what had been highlighted by the different participants. So here I'm just really quickly going to show you who we ended up speaking to. So we got a lot of interviews, as you can see, with landscape architects and with local authority planning officers. And this was due to these are the stakeholders are usually listed in the plans that you can find on the planning portal, whereas the clients, developers, and landscape contractors and managers are not generally listed there and can be really difficult to find. So it required a lot of speaking to other people who had been involved in these projects, Googling, calling offices, and yeah, so they were a lot harder to reach for that reason, and also because perhaps they didn't feel that questions around biosecurity in the planting was as relevant to them as maybe a landscape architect would feel. But we did get some really good information from this that we're really happy to share with you. Next slide. So starting on a positive note, we found a very low incidence of pests and diseases across these projects. So something is obviously going right. However, we also found a very high change in planting compared to the initial plans. The report highlights that while 67% of the stakeholders that we spoke to in the tracing exercises believed that the projects matched the plans completely, the fieldwork showed that this figure was nearer to just a quarter of all the projects for which the fieldwork was carried out. So there is something happening there around lack of awareness of changes across the stakeholder categories, a lack of authorization of changes. So this is a systemic issue. And next one, Mariella. Thank you. And there was also generally very low awareness of biosecurity among those stakeholder groups, as you can see in the figure. None of the participating organizations we spoke to had biosecurity policies, and there was very little awareness also of where the plants had been sourced from or where they had been grown. So very little communication again between the different stakeholders. However, we also found very good engagement with the people that we did manage to speak to. They were very positive and interested in biosecurity and felt that they perhaps needed to learn more. So as a first step, we think that there are plenty of opportunities to increase awareness across the board and just maybe help identify where biosecurity responsibilities should lie. So thank you very much. That was all for me. I'm going to pass on to my colleague, Mike Dunn, who's going to be talking about planting for the environment.
Thanks, Berglind. Yes, so the third project concerned biosecurity risks associated with large-scale planting schemes, hoping to achieve some degree of environmental benefit, whether that be related to habitat creation or connectivity, conservation of particular species, wider biodiversity benefits, or things such as carbon sequestration and water management. So in terms of our research questions, we were wanting to know who's involved in these kind of projects, what the biosecurity risks are along the chain from conception right through to delivery, what drives the decisions and actions of those involved. And then by examining all of the above, we wanted to see if we could learn any lessons for future schemes. Next slide, please, Mariella. So in terms of our method, as with the other projects you've heard about, we looked to see if there was anything else already out there. Not a lot in terms of delivery, in terms of actions and decision making around these kind of schemes, but we were able to identify the major players across Scotland and add those to the stakeholder database. We were also able to identify a number of past, present and future large-scale planting schemes, including those looking to deliver some degree of environmental benefit, even if that was alongside a commercial component. So some of these would go on to form our case studies, and we used related documentation, things such as the management plans, as well as semi-structured interviews, which we had transcribed to derive our findings using thematic analysis. Next slide, please, Mariella. So just a quick look at our case studies. These were chosen from the shortlist that we had input from the project advisory board as well as the research team. And you'll see there we have some geographic diversity. We also tried to get some diversity in terms of the rationale for planting, the ownership, the management, and the planting stage. Next slide, please, Mariella. So no time to kind of dwell on this table, but this just evidences some of those claims I made around diversity. The final column there on the right, the data, there is some disparity there from scheme to scheme in terms of the type and the number of sources. And this really just reflects the different sizes of the respective supply chains and also the age of the schemes. Not always easy to track down some of these people who were involved in schemes that were going on 15 or 20 years ago. Next slide, please, Mariella. So if we fast forward to the findings, the first thing I want to touch on is pest and disease awareness and precautions. I think it's fair to say that many of today's pest and diseases weren't really known or appreciated as threats at the time of planting in some of the more historic schemes. But even today, the perceived threats tend to be around existing and experienced pests and diseases. So things such as your Phytopteras, ash and birch dieback, and Dotostroma. And these tend to be dealt with by either avoiding species or particular provenances. What I thought was interesting is that the likes of Xylella or processionary moth, acute oak decline, emerald ash borer, some of the things that Jerry and Chris have already mentioned, tended not to be considered in the planning and management of these schemes. And it was also striking that some of the interviewees considered Scotland to be at lower risk from pests and diseases than places such as southern England. So I think there is a degree of complacency around emergent threats. However, there's also an acceptance that climate change may present new threats, which some of the actors admitted to being ill prepared for. In terms of pathways, the three main pathways highlighted were through tree supply, particularly the nurseries, and personnel or contractors coming onto site, and natural processes. By natural processes, I'm thinking around things such as windblown spores, which are considered difficult to deal with other than removing or avoiding susceptible species. In terms of the nurseries and the personnel, it's accepted that there's a need to work with nurseries and contractors with biosecurity procedures. Yet when it comes to selecting a nursery, biosecurity considerations are often secondary to finding a nursery able to provide a sufficient quantity of trees. So in all of these schemes we looked at, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of trees. Not all of the nurseries are set up to be able to handle those, particularly if you've got special requests for bringing in your own seed in that you've collected from your site. And the result of this is often a degree of compromise and often a larger supply chain with more nurseries, which can heighten the biosecurity risks. Biosecurity is often a consideration when selecting personnel as well, I should say, but checks are often deemed insufficient, in part because of the large-scale nature of the scheme and the length it takes to kind of get the planting done. So it tends to be that contractors are selected on the basis of reputation and experience, and then they're more or less left to get on with it in a lot of cases. Next slide, please, Mariella. Okay, some things we perhaps wouldn't think of relating to pests and diseases, but right tree, right place came up a number of times. And the reason for that is that it's a common belief that the use of suitable species reduces stress, which can leave trees susceptible to certain pests and diseases. Birch dieback came up a number of times in that case. So to manage for that, people are increasingly using local provenances and doing really careful matching of the trees to the site conditions, right down to such a fine scale, more so than that you would get in a grant application. Also a good practice to think about siting and spacing of susceptible species. So for example, if you're bringing something like juniper into your site, you want to site that away from any tracks where people would be walking or machines, and also to have it away from an existing population of juniper if the site had that. In terms of logistical challenges, occasionally you'd have trees arrive and not matching the specification. There may be no suitable area to receive or to care for these deliveries. And sometimes the delivery and planting schedules weren't aligned. So you'd end up with the trees just kind of sat there in limbo. And again, this was seen to cause unnecessary stress and increase the susceptibility to pests and diseases, even before they got onto the site. Final slide, please, Mariella, some reflections. So I think there is starting to be some consensus around what an ideal scheme would look like in terms of biosecurity. And this tends to be things around locally collected seeds, growing on or close to site. So quite an insular supply chain with a small number of knowledgeable actors. Of course, that's not always feasible in practice, and one of those big challenges is having that tree supply. Over the course of the project, the Forestry Commission announced its National Nursery Notification Scheme, and this is something that's going to be designed to try and ensure that future supply matches future demand. So that should help to lessen compromises during supplier selection. I think until this time, it's just prudent to try and have your most at-risk species handled by your most trusted or proven suppliers. In terms of procurement, this is happening to various degrees, but you should try and include minimum biosecurity standards criteria. That goes for your nurseries as well as your contractors. As I mentioned, best biosecurity practice at the moment is sometimes just assumed. Relatedly, I think it's good to try and have an individual to oversee the scheme's biosecurity at every stage. So from vetting the partners through to ensuring right tree in the right place, biosecurity checks on and off site, and managing logistics. And finally, something for us, I think there's a need for more explicit guidance and training relating to the emerging threats of pest and disease in Scotland to allow for more proactive rather than reactive management. So that's something that I think we as a community need to work on, but also important to acknowledge that practitioners must also be afforded the time to kind of engage with those resources. And at that point, I'll hand over to Rehema.
Thanks very much, Mike. I was involved in the bonus project, which was looking at the potential of ecological and epidemiological models to inform the assessment and mitigation of biosecurity risks, particularly those arising from large planting. And for those of you who know me, I'm not the modeling expert. I was there merely to kind of facilitate some of the conversations. And the models were provided by Louise, Dan, Flora, Sarah, Adam, and Beth, who have the real expertise in this area. So what the aim of our project was actually to try to identify the priority steps and knowledge gaps that would enable more useful models and risk and assessment frameworks to be developed for biodiversity risks and for plant health. And this is understanding, as we've all been aware, that there's an increasing risk from pests and pathogens, with many more on the horizon and a need to understand what's coming in, but also that there's an increasing number of forms of models out there. And so trying to work out how we can best use this predictive capacity to help us. Next slide, please. Our part of the project had two different aspects, and the first was a general review, which was a review of the modelling which has been undertaken to date to support plant biosecurity. And this was an understanding that there are different kinds of models out there that are used for different purposes. So there are some which are used for horizon scanning to understand future threats. There are those which are used for ecological niche models, to try and understand establishment, and for local network analyses, which can help us understand the potential local spread and possible impacts of pests and pathogens. And if you model these kinds of models against the stages of possible pest and pathogen invasion, you can understand how they might be useful for different purposes and at different stages. Not all models are the same. So the diagram to the right, which is in the report, and you can look at that for the detail if you like, says that, for example, horizon scanning is very good for risk assessment at the beginning, and other kinds of models are useful elsewhere. And the blue boxes show the different kinds of data that you might need. And these include not just epidemiological data, but also larger scale environmental data around climate change and some of the social data as well. Some of the points that came out of this review are that we really need more horizon scanning models. We're not that great at predicting what might come in. So far to date, models have been used largely to look at spread. Secondly, we need more integrated socio-ecological models. Because many of the pests and pathogens are coming in because of human transferred plants, we need to understand those trade processes. We need to understand how people affect these processes. And thirdly, thinking about the application, we need to think about whether these models are applied at local, regional, or national scales, and also to have user-friendly applications. So the tools, the way in which the model is used, need to be appropriate. Otherwise, people will not be able to use the model behind it. Next slide, please. The second part of this project was some workshops. We had 2 workshops where we had 14 key informants from across the sector to explore some modeling tools. And first of all, we started with a general discussion about where knowledge came from and the kind of knowledge that you might actually need. And there were some main points that came out of this were firstly that we need a bit of a balance between specific identification and recognizing and addressing complexity. So for example, the plant risk register is highly detailed and is the kind of resource that we need and we need to be inputting to, but it's too complicated for many practitioners to be able to use. We need specific priority actions that can be recommended by models, but at the same time, we need to recommend that we have general pro-plant health good practices and certification and all of the other aspects that my colleagues have been discussing. And finally, we need both policy and practice level advice. And one thing that came out of these workshops was that sometimes this might require different models and different tools. For example, horizon scanning for decision-making for policymakers might be what's required, but the plant health portal might be what's really useful for practitioners with some simple tools on that. Next slide, please. In addition to this discussion, we also had the opportunity for these people in the sector to try out 5 models and tools that had already been developed. So this included the risk modeling for Phytophthora risk factors, an ecological niche tool looking at Phytophthora suitability maps, some horizon scanning, a tool that was specific to juniper and Phytophthora ostracidri, and a tool which allowed people to assess the effects of climate change on the spread of pests and pathogens. And so our workshop participants tried these out and then reported back on some of the ease and some of the possible applicability of these existing models. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we found at the end of this was that the audience needs to be specified. There's no point in producing a model and putting it out to the world. We need to have these specific for particular groups, and that it's good to link to the resources that are being used and that are fundamental to Scottish government, such as the Plant Risk Register. There's a balance between addressing complexity and having lots of different data that you need to choose and different kind of resources that you need to choose, and the tool actually being user-friendly for practitioners. Models are only as good as the assumptions and data. So we recommended more participatory modeling where the modelers sit down with those involved in the trade or in the sector in different ways, and the development of a cross-sectoral database. Sometimes parts of tools or models can help highlight questions as well as actions. And finally, current priority areas for models include risk models for forestry site managers, adaptation of risk analysis for nursery managers, and more input to the landscaping practice decision making. Over to you, Mariella.
Without too many. Let's see if I can get through this last bit now without any technological breakdown. Well done. So that was a really quick whiz through some very detailed research. The reports are quite large and I'm writing some summaries at the moment. But I hope you agree that these projects really were quite novel in terms of who we were trying to reach. And our findings are really interesting. But in several instances, and I do want to raise this again, with projects such as non-specialist retailers, recruiting participants in 05 project from the sort of plans to planting, the sample sizes or the numbers of people we were able to contact, and we tried really hard, are quite small. And if you joined the PHC conference last year, you may remember that was one of my big concerns, and that's without a pandemic. So in the reports, you'll see those caveats, and we'd welcome feedback and your experiences if you're from the relevant sector. So our evidence base is growing. We want to share these examples of good practice as well as the challenges. So in terms of the final reflections, what this research has shown is there's diversity of knowledge on biosecurity. Some people know lots, some people know less, some haven't considered that they need to know anything really. But there isn't a one size fits all to improving knowledge. It has to be targeted at the right people at the right time and through the most effective channels. What is clear is that there is some spatial and temporal gaps, such as knowing about and planning for emerging threats, for example. We're very focused on what's here and now. And despite our best efforts, there are still some stakeholder groups that are missing from the conversation. Excuse me, get my words tangled. There's clarity needed over roles and responsibilities, and ideally better connectivity along the plant supply chain, because currently there's a danger of always assuming that someone else is taking care of pest and disease threats. And what the researchers highlighted is that it would be beneficial to have plant health champions or some equivalent at each stage of the pathway, from the planning through to the planting and beyond. And in that context, we need that systematic structural support in terms of policy and infrastructure that can enable and encourage individual and collective behavioural change. And new schemes like plant healthy certification, for example, is incredibly valuable in raising the biosecurity bar. That's why we started to ask about that, and we've been asking that about in several research projects. But things like, we've noted that good quality is a high preference for consumers and when selecting suppliers, but biosecurity is a low priority. Why is that? How do we unpack that? And how do we ensure that they mean the same thing? Plant healthy and other initiatives are leading the way to that more dialogue, more conversations across stakeholder sectors, connecting us, if you like, and we need those conversations. And centres like this one, the Plant Health Centre, are crucial to that. But finally, I've come to understand that the best way forward, and I've learned this from working through with the advisory panel, and we really did need their help this past year, is a co-design, co-leadership approach with the sectors to bring about that shared vision and collaboration in research, in policy development and in implementation. We need that collaboration. We need to be working more closely. And that just leads me to finish with that aspiration and a call for us to work together. I can see lots of chat coming through, and I just want to thank you and thank the team for pulling this together and getting us through without any technological glitches. It's brilliant. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks very much, Mariella. Yes, technology working perfectly, and thanks also Berglind, Chris, and Rehema. A huge amount of work gone into delivering that synthesis. So we're going to move over to questions now, and actually this session here is then leads straight onto the plenary discussion. So I'm going to hand over to Chris, and first of all we'll take the questions on the biosecurity in Scotland project, and then as we move along, move to the more general questions, and keep those questions coming in the meantime. So handing over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Pete. And a question for Chris, I guess, initially, but I guess any of the other team might want to chip in. And it's around Xylella. And the question was, why do you think that, that your respondents seem less worried about Xylella? And do you think they're aware of the potential control measures on their businesses if Xylella was found on the premises?
Yeah, that's a really good question, important question. I think so first of all, I think the link between knowledge, concern, and then action. So we saw in our data that knowledge was low as well as the level of concern for Xylella. And that could be knowledge of the disease itself as well. And it could be knowledge of the things that Stephen mentioned in his question about the knowledge of the control methods and the consequences that could happen. So there might be a low knowledge of that, which means that's concern. But it's interesting, something that came out in the study that Mike talked about as well, in the people in Scotland feeling perhaps that they were at less of a risk of pests and diseases than those, for example, in southern England. Now that might be the case in what we were looking at as well. We didn't come definitely out of our data, but that could be a thing. And then the final thing is something that's interesting, I think, is that people may well have a lot of confidence in their own processes and their own systems and those of their suppliers. So they might think, okay, it could be a risk, but I know that the way that I'm acting and my suppliers are quite strict, but that's me speculating on those things. We don't have that from the data. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment.
Any of the other team want to add anything?
I think the awareness about Xylella is, if you think about the sectors that we were talking about, it's probably still fairly low. We were talking to the online retailers as well, so they may feel that they've not got that, the restrictions in terms of their businesses being, and the restrictions around their businesses might not affect them that so much because they're a different type of retailer. So that could be one of the issues as well. But it was really surprising that knowledge levels were quite low as well as the concern levels. Something we need to do about, I think, with Bridget.
Great, thanks very much. And then there was a second question also starting with Chris, and that's, you mentioned the sort of gap in the hard to reach, the sort of visibility of that. And the question really is, have we got any sense of how big a gap that hard to reach section of below the radar trade is? Or is that, it's almost sort of circular, I feel, but any response on that?
Yeah, well, I know that there's been a lot of work as part of the Bridget Zyland project as well, with Glyn Jones at FARA, looking at trying to get some of these numbers in to look at the movement of plants and how that might, how that can relate to the risk of pests and diseases. But it's being able, there's lots of data out there because, you know, these businesses obviously collect this data for their business, but it's being able to bring that all together and to look at how the kind of data that they collect, is that the right kind of data for looking at risks of the kind of things that we're interested in. So, but talking to those kind of businesses, getting access to those kinds of data is really tough. And it's about, I think, about building relationships with these organizations to say that we're all going to, you know, we can all work together to help the sector.
I think that's why we were looking at the PHC as well, because I think it's, I mean, we tried really hard and we had, you know, SASA and various others trying for us, making phone calls, individual phone calls. It was a huge job and we still couldn't get people to talk to us or find the time to talk to us. Now, it might be the circumstances. This was an exceptional year, really. But I think we found that really in other projects too. And it's about increasing the relevance of what we're talking about. How do we make it relevant to them? How do we create a safe space that we can bring people together to have these conversations? And so that's why I was looking to the Plant Health Centre to say, right, and the Scottish Government, can you create that safe space? Can you say, this is relevant to you, non-specialist online retailers? We need to start talking to this. We need to have this conversation now. Because otherwise we were just battling on the, you know, underneath the radar, trying to get people to say, look, this is a really important project. Can you talk to us? We're really desperate to get your perspectives, good practices as well as potentially not good practices, or, you know, to flatter them and say, we know you're doing brilliant practices. Please talk to us about it. We went through Twitter and everything we could find, and we still didn't manage to grasp that interest. So it's raising that level of interest, raising that level of importance that we have to bring these people into the room.
Great. Okay, and that sort of links to, I suppose, another question, which is, you've mentioned those challenges, and it was a particular set of circumstances as well. If participants are listening going, oh, why didn't they speak to me or to somebody I know? Is it too late for them to get in touch?
For these reports, yes, but for the agenda of trying to work together collaboratively, absolutely not. I would love to hear from people. You know, we would love to get some connections and get some more experiences. So no, it'd be brilliant if we could hear from people.
Okay. Pete, have you got any comments that you wanted to raise with this team?
No, I was just going to really reiterate that point, that I think these reports are the start point rather than the finish point, and it would be great to get further input onto that. And what we'll be doing with the Plant Health Centre is kind of really working through the synthesis and the distillation of the key findings here, and then working out what are the next steps we need to do to lead towards positive change. So input greatly appreciated.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any, well, I'm maybe failing to multitask fully, but
is there just there's a
couple have come in on procurement. Let me just see. There's really it's a comment, but perhaps you might want to touch on it, and that is one of the procurement challenges for the large schemes is the timetabling of grants available and what that does to the lead-in. I don't know whether you'd like to mention any insights on that.
I would certainly agree with it. We heard that issue of supplies when it comes to plants, and I suppose getting people in it's probably the biggest challenge. And as I mentioned, there are implications there, because although people perhaps want to have a particular nursery, or they might have criteria within their procurement process to say we're going to go to this nursery. They can't always match the requirement in terms of the number of trees. So this nursery notification scheme is only recently been announced, and the objective of that is to get these people together, the people who are going to be wanting the large supplies and the people who are going to be responsible for growing them on. And hopefully try and match that up. But yeah, I mean, you need a couple of years lead in for most of these species. So it's going to take a little time to get off the ground, but hopefully there's some action there that is demonstrating some light at the end of the tunnel, I hope.
Right. And that's sort of encouragement through setting good standards. Is there, do you see much scope for getting procurement to be much more clear about the importance of biosecurity? Because that's the sort of regulatory route or legalistic route. I
think when you're talking about grant schemes, it probably is. I mean, there's always the potential that someone might try and do this off their own, but it's unlikely. So I think that would be the most impactful way to do it, to tie it to grant schemes. And, you know, if you're going to be doing these large scale schemes and being funded to do it, then yes, you need a management plan, and that's an opportunity to put those kind of checks in place around biosecurity and procurement as well.
Yes, I think it should, but biosecurity should be a prominent aspect of procurement everywhere across the supply chain, not just even in grants and environmental planning. It needs to be, it's there, but it's hidden.
We've seen it work in other forms of procurement with sustainability and sustainable supplies and certification of wood, for example, timber being established. So yes, there's some prospects there.
I think it's a combination of events. Sorry if I can just add to that. I think it's a combination. So I think you need the regulation at a certain level. The certification that's coming in is certainly helping, and then setting up these structural processes so that we do have the stock that can come in, and perhaps looking, going back to people who are doing these grants and speaking to them about the kind of consequences, and having them put within the grants conditionality for biosecurity. All of these things will help. But then it's also trying to get to consumers, because I think once consumers start asking for particular products, not just for this area, but across all the areas, will make a really big difference. And that's all of us repeatedly getting our messages out. So the public was hit by Xylella last year, and again this year there was a little flurry of activities, but we just need to keep feeding those in. You saw with your juniper story, people are concerned about their craft gin. And so finding those key points that people can actually relate to draws them into these conversations in a different way. And it'd be good to see some more coming out on that.
Thanks, Rehema.
I just wanted to add to that. Rehema, you were talking about structured processes. And for the large scale planting project, I mentioned briefly that awareness is the first step, but there are also opportunities to look at the ways in which biosecurity features in specification processes. So there was some evidence to show that at the moment it's more of a tick box exercise, and it's not very flexible in terms of thinking through the specific needs of each individual project. Perhaps in some of the systems that are in place, some landscape architects think about this on an individual basis, but there's not really much pushing them towards it. And another area where this could be thought about as well is in local authority planning policies, because if it is a policy, then it's a requirement, and you have to step up and think about these things. So there is scope there to examine other opportunities to improve these structures.
Great, thank you. And while you've been speaking, a couple of additional comments have come in. One is, I suppose, just pointing out that the constraint on plant supply becomes more extreme if you drop below the level of species to the level of provenance. And that then brings in sort of regional constraints. And then another comment around the role of regulation and to what extent you feel that movement of high risk hosts should be regulated.
That's a policy question. Maybe
yeah, we could store that up
in
for
the
somebody, yeah.
plenary.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think probably, Pete, this has probably been enough of a grilling for the team, and I think they've done a great job in presenting what we feel is going to be quite an impactful set of reports.